Boy dies and sees terrifying truth about what dead people are doing right now. What happens after we die? A 17-year-old boy faced this haunting question after a near-death experience changed his life forever. What he saw on the other side will shock you. From ghostly truths to hidden secrets, he uncovers the terrifying reality of what the dead are doing right now. Stick around until the end for the jaw-dropping twist that will leave you speechless. Lucas had always been a cautious boy, the type who checked both sides of the road twice before crossing. That day, however, was different. It was sunny, the kind of rare, crisp autumn day that felt alive with promise. He was riding his bike home from school, earbuds in, his favorite playlist blasting just loud enough to drown out the world. It was his routine, his escape. Lucas loved biking. It gave him freedom, a sense of control. But life has a cruel way of reminding us how little control we truly have. As he turned onto a quiet suburban street, he noticed a black car parked a few blocks ahead. Nothing unusual, just a sedan idling at the curb. He paid it no mind and instead focused on the golden leaves swirling in the air, the faint scent of bonfires in the distance. He was daydreaming about the weekend, about asking out his crush, about anything and everything a 17-year-old might think of when he's on top of the world. And then it happened. The car, which had seemed so innocuous, suddenly roared to life. Lucas barely registered the sound of the engine revving before it surged forward, veering wildly as if the driver had lost control, or maybe never had it to begin with. Time seemed to slow as the car closed the distance between them in an instant. Lucas tried to swerve, but his reflexes couldn't match the car's erratic momentum. There was a deafening screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal on metal, and then silence. For a moment, Lucas thought he'd managed to avoid it. His bike lay crumpled beneath him, but he couldn't feel anything. Not the pavement under his hands, not the sting of the crisp air on his skin. Confusion set in as he tried to process what had just occurred. He was sure he'd heard the impact. He should have felt it. But there was nothing. And then he saw himself. It was the most surreal moment of his life, or death, as he would soon come to understand. His body lay sprawled on the asphalt, motionless. A small crowd of neighbors had already begun to gather, their faces a mixture of shock and panic. Someone was shouting for an ambulance, their voice shaking with urgency. Lucas wanted to tell them he was okay, or at least he thought he was. After all, he felt fine, disoriented, sure, but not hurt. He stood up, or at least he thought he did, and waved to the bystanders, but none of them seemed to notice him. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't standing. He wasn't moving at all. His body lay crumpled on the ground, and yet here he was, watching it all unfold from a perspective he couldn't explain. Panic clawed at his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? A hallucination? He pinched his arm, but he couldn't feel it. He screamed, but no sound came out. And then everything shifted. The world around him began to fade. Not like turning off a light, but like sinking underwater. Colors dulled, sounds became muffled, and the bustling scene of the accident grew distant, as though it were happening to someone else. Lucas felt himself being pulled, though he couldn't see what was pulling him. It wasn't painful, but it was far from pleasant. He wanted to resist, to stay tethered to the life he knew, but he couldn't fight it. He was weightless, powerless, and terrified. Darkness enveloped him, not the kind of darkness you find in a room without light, but an oppressive, all-consuming void that seemed alive. In that moment, Lucas realized something profound. He was no longer in the world he knew. Whatever this place was, it wasn't Earth. He wasn't sure if it was heaven, hell, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. Far in the distance, faint shapes began to emerge, moving like shadows cast on fog. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Lucas felt their eyes on him, if they even had eyes, and an inexplicable weight settled over him. He wanted to cry out, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. What had started as an ordinary bike ride home had turned into the beginning of a journey Lucas could have never imagined. This wasn't just an accident. This was something far greater, far more terrifying than anything he'd ever known. And deep down, he knew there was no going back. Lucas stood frozen in the strange, dark void, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and fear. The shadows he had seen moving in the distance began to take shape, though they remained murky and undefined. They seemed human, or at least they were the size and outline of people, but they moved in a way that was disjointed, unnatural. Some drifted aimlessly, as though they had no purpose, while others repeated the same actions over and over, trapped in an endless cycle. He took a hesitant step forward, not sure what else to do. The ground beneath him felt neither solid nor soft. It simply was, a surface that obeyed none of the rules he had known in life. He glanced down at his feet, but saw nothing. It was as though he was floating, yet anchored, a sensation that defied logic. As he moved closer to the figures, he began to notice details that made his stomach churn. One shadowy form, tall and thin, was pacing back and forth, muttering under its breath. Lucas strained to hear, but the words were garbled, like a radio stuck between stations. Another figure sat on an invisible chair, rocking back and forth, its hands clutching something that wasn't there, a baby, maybe, or a small bundle. The longer he watched, the more he realized these weren't random movements. Each shadow was stuck in some kind of loop, performing the same action endlessly, as if trapped in their own personal nightmare. "Hello?" Lucas called out, his voice trembling. The sound didn't echo. It barely carried at all, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the place. None of the figures responded. They continued their strange, repetitive actions, utterly oblivious to his presence. He tried again, louder this time. "Can anyone hear me? Where am I?" This time, one of the shadows paused. It turned slowly toward him, its movements jerky, like a glitch in a video game. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. The shadow didn't have a face, just a blank, featureless void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Yet somehow, it was staring directly at him. The figure began to shuffle toward him, its steps dragging and uneven. Lucas wanted to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so primal it drowned out everything else. The shadow stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if studying him. For a moment, Lucas thought it might speak, but instead, it reached out with an arm that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "No!" Lucas shouted, finally finding the strength to move. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. The shadow didn't follow. Instead, it resumed its previous activity, as though Lucas no longer existed. It bent down, mimicking the motion of picking up something from the ground, then froze, only to repeat the action again and again. Lucas turned and ran, though he wasn't sure where he was going. The landscape, or lack of it, stretched endlessly in all directions. There were no landmarks, no light sources, nothing to guide him. Yet, as he moved, the shadows grew denser, clustering together in groups. He passed what looked like a man in a suit, sitting at an invisible desk, his hands typing furiously on a keyboard that didn't exist. Nearby, a woman in a flowing dress twirled in slow circles, her arms outstretched as if she were dancing. She didn't smile. Her movements were mechanical, devoid of joy. The deeper he went, the more disturbing the scenes became. A man knelt on the ground, clutching his head in his hands, rocking back and forth as though in agony. Another figure appeared to be shouting, though no sound came from its mouth. Each shadow seemed consumed by some overwhelming compulsion, locked in a never-ending performance of their most defining actions or regrets. Lucas began to realize that these weren't just random spirits. These were the dead, trapped in some kind of limbo. Their actions weren't arbitrary. They were echoes of their lives, the things they had done or failed to do when they were alive. He shuddered as the weight of the realization settled over him. Was this what happened to everyone after death? Were people doomed to relive their mistakes, their obsessions, their regrets for eternity? As he walked, he noticed something else. The figures were avoiding him. Though they didn't seem aware of his presence when he spoke or moved near them, they instinctively parted to give him space, as though some unseen force was keeping them at bay. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. If anything, it made him feel more isolated. Then he heard it, a sound, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, echoing in the silence. Lucas froze, straining to pinpoint the direction. The shadows didn't seem to notice, continuing their endless routines. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be coming from every direction at once. "Lucas!" a voice called, deep and resonant. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. "You shouldn't be here." He spun around, but there was no one there, just the shadows, endlessly moving, endlessly repeating. Yet he could feel the presence of someone or something watching him, observing him from the darkness. The voice came again, louder this time. "Leave while you still can." Lucas wanted to shout back, to demand answers, but fear choked the words in his throat. The voice faded, leaving only the oppressive silence and the haunting tableau of restless spirits. He was alone again, more alone than he had ever felt in his life. Lucas stood motionless in the strange shadow-filled world, the mysterious voice still echoing in his mind. His heart, or whatever part of him felt fear now, thumped loudly in the silence. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from whoever or whatever had just spoken to him. But he knew deep down that shouting into this void would be useless. This was a place where the rules of life, of sound, and of existence itself didn't seem to apply. As he struggled to make sense of what was happening, Lucas noticed a faint light flickering in the distance. It was unlike anything he had seen so far, neither the ghostly glow of the shadows nor the consuming darkness of the void. This light was warm, golden, and it pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Without thinking, Lucas began to walk toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though some unseen force was pulling him back. But he pressed on, compelled by an overwhelming need to reach the light. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating what appeared to be towering figures standing in its midst. They were enormous, at least 3 times his height, their forms radiant and indistinct, as though they were made of pure energy. They shimmered and flickered, their outlines constantly shifting between sharp clarity and soft blurriness, as if they existed only partially in this world. Lucas stopped in his tracks, awestruck and terrified in equal measure. These beings were unlike anything he had ever imagined. They had no faces, no distinct features, yet their presence was overwhelming. It was as if they radiated authority, wisdom, and a kind of ancient power that made Lucas feel impossibly small. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Their light was hypnotic, and their mere existence demanded his attention. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements fluid and deliberate. It raised an arm, though Lucas couldn't be sure it was an arm, as it was more a column of light than a limb, and gestured for him to come closer. He hesitated, but something inside him urged him to obey. Slowly, he moved forward, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. When he was close enough, the figure seemed to speak, though its voice didn't come from any mouth or source he could see. Instead, it resonated directly in his mind, a deep, resonant tone that felt more like a thought than a sound. "You are not meant to be here," it said, the words reverberating in his head. "You are still tethered to the world of the living." Lucas swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What is this place? What are you?" The being didn't answer immediately. Instead, it turned to gesture at the restless shadows surrounding them. "This is the threshold, the place between worlds. Those you see here are the lost, the ones who cannot move forward. They cling to the echoes of their lives, bound by their choices, their fears, their regrets." Lucas looked around at the figures he had passed earlier, their endless loops now taking on a new, horrifying significance. "They're stuck? Forever?" "Not forever," the being replied, its tone tinged with a kind of solemnity. "But for as long as they hold on to what binds them. Some find release in time, others do not. It is not for us to decide." Lucas shuddered at the thought. "And me? Why am I here?" The being's light seemed to flicker, as though considering its answer. "You are an anomaly, a soul caught between worlds. Your body clings to life, but your spirit has wandered too far. That is dangerous. Few return unchanged." "Return?" Lucas asked, his voice rising in desperation. "I can go back? How?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and gestured to the other beings who stood silently in the background, their forms pulsating with light. Slowly, they moved aside, revealing what lay behind them. A swirling vortex of light and shadow spinning endlessly like a portal. Its edges crackled with energy, and Lucas could feel its pull from where he stood, a magnetic force that seemed to reach inside him and tug at his very essence. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The way forward," the being said simply. "For the living, it is the way home. For the dead, it is the path to judgment." Lucas took a step back, his fear overwhelming. "Judgment? What does that mean? What happens to them?" The being didn't reply, but the silence was answer enough. Lucas glanced back at the portal, its swirling depths both mesmerizing and terrifying. He thought of the shadows, endlessly repeating their actions, trapped in their own torment. Was this their alternative? To face whatever lay beyond the vortex? The thought made his stomach churn. "I don't understand," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "Why? Show me this. What am I supposed to do?" "You must choose," the being said. Its tone was neutral, almost detached, but Lucas could sense the gravity of its words. "Stay, return, or move forward. The choice is yours, but understand this. Every choice carries weight. Every path has consequences. Lucas felt his mind spinning, his thoughts racing as he tried to process everything. Stay? Return? Move forward? He didn't even know what those choices truly meant. How could he decide when he didn't understand the rules of this place? Before he could ask another question, the being stepped closer, its light growing brighter until it was almost blinding. "Beware the whispers," it said, its voice a low, resonant hum. "Not all who wander here are benevolent. Some will try to lead you astray." With that, the being turned and rejoined the others, their forms blending into the golden light until they were indistinguishable from one another. Lucas was left alone once more, standing in the vast, empty expanse, the vortex looming ahead of him. He felt its pull again, stronger this time, and he took a step toward it without thinking. But then he stopped. The being's warning echoed in his mind. Beware the whispers. What did it mean? Was the voice he had heard earlier one of the whispers, or was it something else entirely? He glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but the shadows continued their restless loops, oblivious to his presence. For the first time since arriving in this strange place, Lucas felt the full weight of his situation. He wasn't just lost. He was being watched, judged, and perhaps even hunted. Lucas stood at the edge of the swirling vortex, his mind a chaotic storm of questions and fears. The radiant beings were gone now, leaving him alone once more in the oppressive expanse. The golden light they had brought with them was fading, and the shadows seemed to encroach upon him, their restless movements growing more erratic. He could still feel the pull of the portal ahead, but something in his gut told him he wasn't ready to step through, not yet. As he turned away from the vortex, the silence around him began to shift. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint hum at the edge of his awareness. But as he listened, the hum grew louder, transforming into a chorus of whispers. The voices overlapped, their words indistinct but urgent, like a crowd of people murmuring secrets just out of earshot. Lucas spun around, trying to locate the source. But the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. His pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from vague curiosity to something darker, something hungry. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The only response was a low, guttural laugh, faint but chilling, like the sound of nails scraping against glass. The air grew colder, and Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. The shadows around him began to move differently now, not in their endless loops, but with purpose. They drifted closer, their forms twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. It was as though they were aware of him for the first time, and their attention was suffocating. "Stay back!" Lucas shouted, taking a step backward. His foot scraped against the ground, if it could be called that, but there was no reassuring sensation of solidity beneath him. The shadows continued to advance, their movements slow but deliberate. He could see their forms more clearly now, hollow faces with empty eyes, hands outstretched as if reaching for him. They didn't speak, but the whispers seemed to emanate from them, filling his mind with disjointed fragments of words. "Help me," one voice hissed, barely audible. "Lost. Forever." Another whispered, the words dripping with despair. Lucas tried to cover his ears, but it was useless. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head, burrowing into his thoughts like parasites. He stumbled backward, his breathing ragged, and tripped over something invisible, landing hard on the ground. Before he could scramble to his feet, a figure emerged from the crowd of shadows, larger and more defined than the others. It moved with a sinister grace, its body shifting and reforming with every step. Unlike the others, this one had a face that was disturbingly familiar. Lucas gasped as he realized he was staring at himself. The doppelganger's face was a distorted mirror of his own, its features twisted into a grotesque mockery. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that seemed to split its face into E. It crouched down, leaning in close, and spoke in a voice that sounded like Lucas's own, but layered with something darker, something ancient. "You don't belong here," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "But since you've come, you might as well stay." Lucas scrambled backward, his heart pounding. "What are you? Why do you look like me?" The figure laughed, a low guttural sound that made Lucas's skin crawl. "I am you, or at least the part of you that you've tried to bury. Your fears, your regrets, your failures. All the things you'd rather forget. They thrive here, in the in-between." "I don't believe you," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "You're just another shadow, another trick." "Believe what you want," the figure replied, its grin widening. "But the more you deny me, the stronger I become. Face it, Lucas, you're not ready to leave. Not until you confront the truth." Before Lucas could respond, the figure lunged at him, its hands clawing at his chest. He cried out, but instead of pain, he felt a surge of memories flooding his mind. Moments from his past, both good and bad, all rushing at him in a chaotic blur. The time he cheated on a test and lied about it. The argument with his best friend that he never resolved. The promises he had broken, the opportunities he had wasted. Every regret, every failure, every fear laid bare before him. "Stop!" Lucas shouted, tears streaming down his face. I can't do this." The figure leaned in closer, its empty eyes boring into his soul. "You don't have a choice." Just as Lucas felt himself beginning to break, a new voice cut through the darkness, strong and commanding. "Enough!" The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The doppelganger snarled, but stepped back, its grin fading. Lucas looked up to see a figure approaching from the distance, bathed in a soft, silver light. It wasn't one of the radiant beings from before, but it exuded a similar sense of authority and calm. The figure knelt beside Lucas, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than this," it said gently. "Don't let them consume you." Lucas blinked, his vision clearing. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows had retreated, leaving him alone with the mysterious figure. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure smiled, though its features were still obscured by the silver light. "A friend," it said simply. "For now, that's all you need to know." Before Lucas could ask more, the figure helped him to his feet and pointed toward the distance. "You're close to the truth," it said, "but you must keep moving. Trust your instincts and remember, not everything here is as it seems." With that, the figure stepped back, fading into the light until it was gone. Lucas stood there for a moment, his mind racing. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also given him a newfound determination. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, he turned back toward the swirling vortex in the distance, the path ahead now clearer than ever. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew one thing. He was ready to face it. Lucas moved forward, each step bringing him closer to the swirling vortex of light and shadow. The portal was mesmerizing and terrifying, its edges crackling with a chaotic energy that seemed alive. He could feel it pulling at him, as if it recognized him and wanted to draw him in. Yet, despite the fear clawing at his chest, he kept moving. Something compelled him to press on, something he couldn't name but knew was important. As he approached the vortex, the whispers began again. These were different from before, though. Softer, more melodic. They didn't fill him with dread, but with a strange, bittersweet longing, like hearing a lullaby from a forgotten childhood. The voices overlapped, creating a chorus that resonated deep within him. It felt as though the air itself was humming with emotion. The vortex shimmered, and Lucas saw something new within its swirling depths. Images flashed before him, quick and fleeting, like snapshots from another life. He saw faces he didn't recognize, but felt as if he should. A young woman with tears streaming down her face, a child laughing as they chased a kite through a field, an old man sitting alone in a dimly lit room, staring at a photograph. Each image tugged at his heart, filling him with emotions that weren't entirely his own. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the vortex. "Why are you showing me this?" The vortex didn't answer, but the images continued to flicker, each one more vivid than the last. Lucas reached out instinctively, his hand trembling as it neared the edge of the swirling energy. The moment his fingertips brushed the surface, the world around him shifted again. The shadows disappeared, replaced by a dazzling expanse of light. It was blinding at first, but as his eyes adjusted, Lucas realized he was standing in what appeared to be an enormous stage. The floor beneath him gleamed like polished marble, and above him, an endless canopy of stars sparkled against a velvet black sky. The air was warm, filled with a faint, familiar melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He turned slowly, taking in his surroundings. The stage was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt alive, as though it were waiting for something, or someone. The melody grew louder, and Lucas's heart began to race. He recognized the song now, though he couldn't remember where he'd heard it before. It was haunting, yet beautiful, filled with a raw, unfiltered emotion that sent chills down his spine. Then, out of the shadows at the edge of the stage, a figure stepped forward. At first, Lucas thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure moved with an effortless grace, each step deliberate and fluid. They were dressed in a sequined jacket that caught the starlight and reflected it in dazzling patterns. A single white glove covered one hand, and a black fedora was tilted low, obscuring their face. But there was no mistaking who it was. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light and lifted their head. It was Michael Jackson. Lucas stared, frozen in disbelief. The king of pop stood before him, his presence commanding yet strangely comforting. There was an aura about him, an energy that was both otherworldly and deeply human. Michael smiled, a warm, knowing smile that seemed to say he had been expecting Lucas all along. "You made it," Michael said, his voice soft but resonant. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that seemed to reach into Lucas's very soul. "I've been waiting for you." Lucas struggled to find his voice. I don't understand. What is this place? Why are you here?" Michael tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "This place, it's not one thing. It's different for everyone. For some, it's a crossroads. For others, a sanctuary. And for you, well, it's a stage." "A stage?" Lucas repeated, glancing around. "Why?" "Because this is where you'll find your truth," Michael replied. He gestured toward the stars above. Every soul leaves something behind, a legacy, a memory, a story. This stage is where those stories come alive. Lucas shook his head, overwhelmed. I'm not like you. I don't have a legacy. I'm just a kid. I haven't done anything important. Michael's smile widened and he stepped closer. Every life is important, Lucas. Every choice, every action, every moment. You don't have to be famous to leave a mark. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. Lucas looked down at his feet, his thoughts racing. But why me? Why are you talking to me? Michael chuckled softly. Because you're at a turning point. You've seen things most people never will. You've touched the edge of the beyond. And now you have a choice to make. What choice? Lucas asked, his voice trembling. To go back or to move forward, Michael said simply. You've been given a glimpse of what lies ahead, but your story isn't finished yet. The question is, are you ready to write the next chapter? Lucas hesitated, his mind flooded with doubt. What if I go back and fail? What if I don't make a difference? Michael placed a gloved hand on Lucas's shoulder, his gaze steady and kind. Failure isn't the end. It's just a part of the journey. What matters is that you try, that you live, that you love. The rest will take care of itself. For a moment, Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him, a quiet reassurance that he hadn't felt since the accident. He looked up at Michael, who nodded as if he already knew Lucas's decision. I want to go back, Lucas said, his voice firm. I'm not ready to leave everything behind. Not yet. Michael's smile grew and he stepped back, raising his hand in a gesture of farewell. Then go, Lucas, and remember, your life is your stage. Make it unforgettable. The light around Michael began to intensify, and the stage dissolved into a blur of stars. Lucas felt himself being pulled backward, the world around him spinning faster and faster until everything went black. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the pavement, the sound of sirens in the distance. The pain hit him all at once, but it was a small price to pay. He was alive. And as he looked up at the sky, he could still hear the faint echo of Michael's voice, a reminder that every moment mattered.